You're late for dinner, Hogarth. Your mom's working late tonight, Hogarth. So it's just us guys, and we're gonna have a little chat. Sit down. How's that? A little too bright? Good. Forgive me, Hogarth. I wanted you to learn something.
What can I learn from you?
You can learn this, Hogarth, that I can do anything I want, whenever I want, if I feel it's in the people's best interest. The giant metal man. Where is it?
I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't? Wow. Does this ring a bell? No? How about this? You've been careless, Hogarth.
It doesn't prove anything.
It's enough to get the army here with one phone call.
Then what's stopping you?
Where's the giant? You can't protect him, Hogarth, any more than you can protect your mother.
My mom?
It's difficult to raise a boy all alone. We could make it more difficult. In fact, we could make it so difficult that it would be irresponsible for us to leave you in her care. And all that implies. You'll be taken away from her, Hogarth.
You can't do that!
Oh, we can. And we will.
He's in the junkyard. I'm copping scrap off Culver Road.
Junkyard, of course. Food for the metal eater. I wouldn't worry about this, Hogarth. It isn't really happening. This is only a bad dream. Where's the giant? This is only a bad dream. Yes. This is real, sir.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest and a fellow podcaster, and that is David Weinberger. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for asking. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you. So before we jump into today's discussion, we like to kind of let new guests talk a little bit about themselves. So why don't you tell people what your deal is?
So to get back to it, so my name is David. I am one half of the Shonen Flop Podcast, where me and my co-host Jordan talk about the wonderful world of manga that ran in Shonen Jump. For those who may not be familiar, Shonen Jump is the largest manga magazine in the world. It's things where Dragon Ball Z, One Piece, and Naruto all came from, but not everything in that series can be a hit. There's a lot of garbage in it too. So me, Jordan, and a guest, we take a look at the lesser known series and see were they a flop or not, and what they did wrong, what they did right, and ultimately what could they have done to potentially become a hit. And you can find us at Shonen Flop. That's SHONENFLOP. And you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you find your podcasts, and on Twitter at Shonen Flopcast.
Very cool. Yeah, and we'll have all the links and all that in the show notes, so people can easily find it there. Awesome. So how long have you guys been doing the show?
We just had our 2-year anniversary about 3 weeks ago, actually. So yeah. So I know we're just still a baby podcast.
Yeah, I know what that's like. So what are some of the what do you think so far is like the best unfairly canceled manga that you've read so far?
So we actually just did a special where we ranked every single series we'd ever read, and it's actually kind of depressing how many of the series are just kind of garbage. Some of the good ones we've read is probably Time Paradox Ghostwriter, and that's a manga about an author who is aspiring to success, and he has a magical microwave that sends him copies of Shonen Jump from the future, and he starts plagiarizing that magazine. Mm-hmm. Some other favorites include Double Taisei, which is pretty much what if you had the energy of the Fast and Furious, but was about playing a form of chess.
Okay.
And King, which is what if Beatles could talk. And it's a very interesting and fun series, but we have read some absolutely absurd things that I don't think I even have the time to go into all of the absolute garbage that we've had the displeasure of reading.
So some of them are fairly flopped then.
I would say 1 in 10 series is something I don't regret reading.
Okay.
Yeah. When we started the podcast, we think hidden gems, and then we were like, wow, we have read a lot of garbage.
Yeah. It's funny when you think about the American industry, because the American comic industry, there's usually a ton of stuff that gets unfairly canceled. But I guess because the Japanese manga industry is so huge and so much more successful, they tend to have a lot more flops than that are fairly flopped.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm unfortunately not as well versed in American comics. I used to be really big into it, and I need to get back. We actually used to have a book club in my Discord. I'm not sure if you use Discord much, but every month. But unfortunately, the person who ran it just got too busy to keep going.
Oh, that's too bad.
It is.
So let's talk a little bit about how you got into this stuff, because you mentioned in our correspondence before we jumped on the show that you're a fan of superhero movies. And
yes.
So what was kind of like your gateway into the world of like superhero movies, comic books, all this kind of like nerdy stuff?
I feel I had a high school teacher that was super into comics, so I think that was a big influence of it. And then I think really just I was in the sweet spot for when the MCU started. I was in like 9th, 10th grade, and I just followed it from there. And it's been a lot of fun. I've seen every MCU movie at least twice because I rewatched them all, and then some of them I've seen probably 5+ times, including I've seen Thor: Dark World 3 times because I had to for a podcast. So. The sacrifices we make to be on the shows, but I'm really glad though I didn't have to regret that I rewatched the Iron Giant for this episode.
Okay, yeah, we actually just recorded an episode on the Dark World fairly recently, so that's a pretty timely.
Oh geez, now why would you do that?
Oh no, I actually, the Dark World, it's not my favorite. All right, it's definitely down on the list, but it's not a movie I hate. I'll put it that way.
Okay, that's fair.
But I also had a kind of a similar experience where I also had a high school teacher who was very into comics, who has actually been on the show before too. And he, even though I was into comics before I met him, he was a cool guy who was into comics. And that made me realize like, oh wow, we don't have to be ashamed of this. We can be open about liking comic books and stuff like that.
For sure. I remember I had a great experience where I had a great experience where me, him, and our friend of mine, we went through top 10, and he explained all the experiences. Though actually, on that note, on my show, we actually had the artist of top 10 as a guest, which was really exciting.
Is that the Alan Moore comic you mean?
Yes.
Oh,
so
okay,
we had Xander Cannon. I knew it was the name that started with a Z. So yes, so we had the pleasure of having Xander Cannon on one of our episodes.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. All right. So today we're talking about, like you had mentioned, The Iron Giant, which was a 1999 film, animated film that came out. Didn't do very well in the theater. It was kind of
really
a flop.
did not.
Yeah. It only made 31 million of its 50 million budget, and it was but it developed a really big cult following, and it's kind of probably most notable for being like the thing that really kind of launched Brad Bird and brought him to a lot of people's attention. Now, when this movie came out, I never saw it when it came out because I was this was like when I was just starting high school, I believe. I think it was like in my first year of high school, first or second year when this came out. So yeah, I was kind of in that stage when I'm like, oh, American animation, that's all kid stuff. I don't want anything to do with that type of.
Brad Bird would be so upset to hear you think that.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely matured since then, but that was kind of the attitude of a lot of like animated stuff that wasn't Japanese animation at the time. It was just kind of like, oh, American animation, it's all for kids, it's not worth watching or anything like that. It was definitely that kind of like edgy teen edgelord type of bullshit phase that I was going through.
Exactly.
What about you? Because this obviously you were younger than me, because you said you were like 9 or 10 when the MCU started coming out. So,
oh no, I was in 9th or 10th grade.
Okay, so yeah, so you're a little bit younger than me. So what was your experience when this movie came out?
Let me think about that. Also, by the way, I have a fan on the background, so let me know if it's too loud. I found that in my recordings it doesn't pick up. I just want to give you a heads up that if for any reason I can turn it off if it's causing issues.
I'm not picking up anything, so we're good.
Okay,
there.
and then if you hear that jostling, that's just me drinking water.
Okay, no problem.
So yeah, so that 2002, I think I was about 11 years old. So yeah, definitely a little bit behind you. And I do remember actually seeing this in theaters. I think I was just going on like message boards and people were hyping this movie up. So I made sure to go see it. I distinctly remember in high school talking to my film studies teacher. I lent him a copy of it, which he swears he gave back. He never did. So I lost my copy of The Iron Giant. Very upset about that. It was a special edition. So I definitely remember this being a really fun movie. And that's really what stuck out to me is I have always loved The Iron Giant. And I just, to be honest, I was overdue to rewatch it. So I'm so glad that I got to rewatch it for this show.
Okay, yeah. So that's so my first experience actually watching, because I like I said, when it came out, I remember seeing the ads, but wasn't really interested in it. And I had been hearing about this movie, for years. Like everybody been saying, like the Iron Giant is so good. And it's one of those things, everybody tells you that there's this movie you have to watch, and you're just like, oh yeah, I'll get to it. And then you just never get around to watching it. And I had actually bought it about like, I think it was probably like a year or two ago when I was back in the States visiting, and I was at a used DVD store and they had it. So I picked it up for like something like $2 and then just put it in my collection. And just like I've got like 100 movies that I haven't watched in my collection. So it just became another one of those on the I'll get to it someday pile. So I'm actually really glad that you picked this, because I'm like, oh, good. Now I can finally watch this movie.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it quite met the definition of superhero, but it does have all that Superman stuff. So I figured I might as well just try and go with something that hopefully no one else has thought of recommending.
Right. Yeah. It's not. I mean, I think it's definitely one of those movies that's kind of skirting the edges of the superhero genre, but it's close enough, and it's my show, so I make the rules, so I could say it's a superhero movie.
That's fair. I feel like if I was forced to do something unconventional, maybe I would have done like one of the Japanese like Super Sentai or Kamen Rider, which are Japanese, just because like, man, it's hard to find something that's already been covered now. You have over 100 episodes.
Yeah, we're getting to that point now. We're gonna have to start scraping a little bit, but surprisingly, there's still a bunch that we haven't covered. So
really, what would you say is the most lowest hanging fruit you haven't covered yet?
The first Spider-Man movie.
Real? How's no one done that?
Or like pretty much most of the X-Men movies, surprisingly, we haven't covered. Like we've done X2, we've done Days of Future Past, and we've done First Class and Logan and Dark Phoenix, and that's it. But like X2 has not been covered yet. The Last Stand, the other two Wolverine movies, all those haven't been covered yet. So yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those things. We only just recently finally had someone to come on to talk about Spider-Man 2. So yeah, it's kind of surprising that it's taken us this long to get to a lot of these.
That was actually my first pick of Spider-Man 2, and then when I saw it, I was like, all right, everything's probably taken, so I'll do the Iron Giant.
But this was a good one, and it's very much influenced by the it's much more, I wouldn't call it so much a superhero movie. It's much more of a pulp movie. It's very much in that kind of vein. I got a lot of like Flesher vibes watching it too, from like the old Superman animated shorts they used to do back in the 1930s, 1940s.
Oh yeah, I remember those. They used to run them on Cartoon Network sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, and they're like public domains. Like everybody has released a DVD of them.
Oh, that's awesome.
So what were some of your thoughts rewatching this movie?
I would say that the first thing was this movie is very slow paced in a way I don't think they make movies anymore. Like they let the scenes kind of, I'm trying to think of the proper term, but like they really let the scene just play out. There's not a lot of hard cuts. There's not a lot of franticness. It's still, of course, well directed and well shot, but there's a very deliberate kind of slowness to the pacing and editing of the film. And to be honest, like I 100% do not think they probably could release a movie that's this slow pace targeted towards children nowadays.
Yeah, I think they would have definitely edited it down to like, I mean, because it's not a long movie.
It's not a long movie.
Right. So you would have probably been able to edit it down to maybe like a little over an hour and change with just by cutting down on some of those scenes. At least for, like you said, for more modern kid audiences. My impression was I did feel that the pacing was a lot slower than I expected. Just judging from what I'd seen about the trailers and all that. And it seemed like it was a much more fast-paced movie than it actually turned out to be. But I wasn't bored watching it, right? It wasn't like the pacing was so slow that I felt bored watching it. The pacing was slow, but it was fine. It didn't feel like it was unnaturally slow or anything like that. Although one thing I will say is I was kind of surprised when I'm getting to the end of the movie and I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, wait a minute, I've been watching this movie for about an hour now and it's under an hour and a half and they haven't even begun to get towards like the big climactic event yet.
Yeah, I definitely, I think if I watched this and someone said, how long do you think that movie is? I probably would have said 2 hours and change.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
How long? Do you know how long its actual runtime is? I know it's an hour 40.
It's according to Wikipedia, it's 87 minutes. There was an extended remastered version of
with
the
2
film
extra minutes.
with 2 extra minutes. Okay, so it's not that much of a so yeah, it's just 87 minutes, just under an hour and a half.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's probably why the pacing is so slow. Is you literally can't make a movie shorter than this and release in theaters.
Yeah, probably. I think another thing is a lot of animated movies, they were targeting them, especially at this time period. They were kind of shooting for like 90 minutes is the absolute limit of them. Like if you look at a lot of the DC direct-to-video animated movies, they're all under 90 minutes. And someone pointed out to me one time that it was because they were airing them like on Cartoon Network and all that, and they would split it up into like 3-episode blocks basically. So that's, or 2-episode blocks. That's why they had it edited the way they did.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I was looking at Quest for Camelot, which was like kind of their contemporary, and that likewise is 84 minutes.
Yeah, and that was actually there was a lot of skepticism about this movie because of Quest for Camelot, because that had completely tanked. And this was a weird time for animation, because this was a time when you had some other studios that were kind of trying to compete with Disney, but it was before Pixar had really kind of broken in. And so like you had these small little movies that were done that weren't Disney films, that, and some of them were actually pretty good, but they were they're kind of like almost written off. Like American animation was in this really weird kind of growing pains phase, I remember. Yeah.
It's also, this is really when computer assisted animation, and that really changed the game where how far you could get with your budget. Like it's actually quite interesting. I do wonder if it was deliberate that really, the Iron Giant, the CGI holds up pretty well, but it's literally the easiest thing you can do in CGI. Well, is a large mechanical, like with lots of sharp edges.
I think something else that they did, which was smart, is that they didn't go overboard with the CGI, because that's the fault of a lot of early CGI animation. Is they're like, we can do all this stuff with computers. Let's like throw all the bells and whistles we can onto it. And then when you look at it now, it looks terrible, right? It's just, it looks completely, but, and I think, I'm not sure if it was Brad Bird who made this decision or someone in the animation department or whoever it was, but someone said, we want to try to make this look as close to hand-drawn animation as possible, right? We're using CGI, but we're using CGI to animate something that would traditionally be 2D, instead of trying to make it look like 3D animation. I think that also the fact that it's, like you said, it's, it's very simple animation, right? It's a hard edge mechanical robot. So it's much easier to animate as opposed to like if you're doing a human. But I think that focusing on that simplicity and just saying, we're going to use CGI to do the simplest thing instead of going overboard with it, I think that was a very good decision.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Now, also too, rewatching it, because now I'm a man in his late 30s. So watching this movie now as a man in his late 30s, I'm watching this movie and I'm definitely feeling like I am so not the target audience for this movie. Because it's not that I didn't like it or anything like that. It's just that when I watch movies where young children are the main character, it's really hard for me to kind of connect to it. So like I found myself connecting a lot more with Dean than anyone else in the movie.
I mean, Dean was probably the best character in the movie. I also have like, what is it, like the Mandela effect, where you have like a false memory. I swear that Johnny Depp played him in this movie.
Oh, really?
I don't know why, but I had this very vivid memory that it was voiced by Johnny Depp, which is not true.
No, it's not. It was Harry Connick Jr. actually, I think.
Yeah,
Harry Connick Jr.
It's interesting. Johnny Depp wasn't even on like the list they actually list the considered actors for him. And Johnny Depp wasn't even on that list. So I don't know where I got this idea that Johnny Depp played him. I mean, I could see Johnny Depp playing him though.
Yeah, I definitely could. I think like, especially that first scene he's in when he's in the diner with the sunglasses and all that, and he's like this beatnik kind of character. So yeah, he's definitely got a Depp vibe, or at least, pre-lazy Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
Jennifer Aniston as she also kind of surprised me, because I'm listening to her and I knew she was in this, but
yeah,
it was still kind of funny watching the movie and just thinking, like, hearing her voice, and I'm like, I still can't believe that's Jennifer Aniston. Like, something about it just didn't I knew I knew it was her voice, but something about her, I think it was just different from the characters I'm used to seeing her play.
Yeah, it was a very subtle performance, and it was interesting that she was in it. And I feel like I think her fine. I also had an issue where for some reason on HBO Max, the audio leveling was really bad. And I actually had trouble hearing. So I had to keep changing. So it makes it hard for me to truly know the quality of the performances because I struggle to hear them sometimes because just for HBO Max, for some reason, it's really bad audio leveling for this movie.
Oh, okay. See, I watched it on the DVD, so that didn't have those issues. But Vin Diesel also really impressed me in this. And it's just because I said we did Bloodshot fairly recently, and I said on that episode that my issue with Vin Diesel as an action star is that I don't feel like he's leading man action star material, right? He's not like a Dwayne Johnson. He's not like a Jason Statham. He doesn't have that same kind of presence that a lot of other action stars have. But in something like this, in these more character-based roles, like when he does the voice of the Iron Giant, when he does the voice of Groot, or in something more subdued, like in Pitch Black, right? He's great. What do you think of his voice?
I think he did a great job. It was like, I mean, he has maybe 10 lines. It's very much like his performance in Guardians of the Galaxy. So I don't have much to say about it. I think this was definitely before his career. This is definitely pre-Fast and Furious, I believe.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's definitely not a star shower. And it is, I think it's more, to be honest, his performance is going to be best known as a piece of trivia that he had like 10 lines in this movie.
Right, probably.
Over anything else in terms of his contribution to this film.
Well, I think that's one of the things I've heard the most about this movie since, like Vin Diesel voiced the Iron Giant. Like after he hit it big with the Fast and Furious movies, I think a lot of people went back and then kind of took another look at this movie because of that, or maybe took a first look at this movie.
Yeah.
So what are some other things that kind of stood out to you watching it this last time?
So let's see. I also really appreciate that they actually had a child voice the main character. I think the performance was a little wooden, but this was actually a child voice.
Yeah.
Which is always a nice treat when you actually have a child performing.
Right. Something I was surprised too, rewatching, is just how heavily the Cold War themes were in this.
Yeah, right. And they really talk about duck and cover, which is, become a lot more relevant nowadays with what's going on.
Right, but also like the Sputnik stuff, like all of that being in there, and just like how xenophobic Kent Mansley is in this. And yeah, I was kind of surprised at how heavy a lot of the themes are, but they do a good job of like giving you a little bit of these themes and kind of making it does a good job of making you feel what it was like to be alive back then. I mean, it doesn't go, obviously it's a movie about, a boy and his Iron Giant, but it's still, it keeps it relatively grounded despite that.
Yeah. I mean, the entire movie does a great job of just being a metaphor, especially with the, I forget, sorry, I am terrible with character names. Let me get the list of characters up. With, I think, Kent.
Yeah.
With Kent and how he's just kind of represents in the McCarthy era, just Red Scare, where I really like that metaphor of how he becomes so self-destructive. He literally is self-destructing at the end of the movie, where he's literally going to kill himself because he's become so obsessed with this dealing with the enemy ideology.
Right. Yeah. That it was pretty. It's kind of shocking to watch that in a kids movie, actually, when I think about it, especially because portraying the government agent as the villain. Right. That's not something you see happen in a lot of kids movies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not unheard of. Like, look at like E.T. and there's other ones where they're like children interacting with the friendly alien or what have you. So I think that's kind of what it's playing into, is that sort of trope where there's a certain fear of authority. And I think that's why I think that Dean is such an interesting, because he is a counterculture character. And by being counterculture, he is the supportive one. Like that restaurant scene or diner scene at the start is a really great scene where he was like, yeah, I saw it too. Like, did you really? He's like, no, but I wanted to make that guy feel like he was being supported. And that just speaks volumes about the nature of Dean's character and, how he's the only other person that really is able to tolerate the giant.
It also speaks a lot about that time period, right? And just like how, and I like that too, that he had that line, because usually in a movie like this, nobody would be supporting someone who's coming up with these outlandish theories or anything like that. You wouldn't have any adults who are really kind of like standing by the kid, like trusting the kid and all that. But you have that in Dean a lot, and I really like that aspect of it.
Yeah. I think something else that unrelates to that is I think it's very interesting how he is the son of a single mother, and they don't really talk about the father. And it's very much left up to your interpretation. I think that was a very powerful, creative decision.
Mhm.
And it does, of course, let freaking what's his, I always forget his name of the agent, Kent just slot in so well into
Mhm.
the presence of his mother in a way that if he had a father figure, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, I think so too. Now, according to Wikipedia, it says that Hogarth's father was he was an Air Force pilot who died in the Korean War. But I can't remember if there was any real references to that in the movie, or any or if there were, then I missed them.
Yeah, I'm with you as well.
But one thing that kind of took me out of it a little bit was the military guy, the general Rogard, who he eventually sides with Dean and the kid, and he's against Kent, launching a nuclear. And I feel like that's where the movie felt like they had to play it a little bit safe, and they kind of had to show that Kent was an outlier. Whereas in reality, I think a Rogard type character would have been, well, yeah, let's bomb the shit out of him.
That's fair.
What are some other things here? One of the things that surprised me is John Mahoney of Frasier. He played. He ended up playing Rogard in this.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea. It's so interesting how there's so much talent in this movie and you just don't know about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because everyone is just kind of very subdued.
Yeah. That's another thing. I think that's probably another reason why maybe it didn't quite find so much of an audience at first. It is and this kind of ties into what we were saying before about the pacing. It is very subdued. It's very up until the end, and even that's not that big of a situation. It is a very low key film. It's not like, I'm trying to think of what other animated movies were coming out at the same time that have been comparable to this, but it doesn't seem like it would have competed very much with them on that same level.
No, and I think that's a really good observation.
I mean, yeah, so I'm looking at this now, and it says that, we had Tarzan come out at the same time. Toy Story 2 came out at the same time. So all these movies that were much bigger and much more impactful, whereas this one definitely was much smaller in scale overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny though you say that it's small in scale when it's about a giant robot, but that is true. Like, it's just him. There's really no big set pieces to this movie either.
Right.
And it's so interesting how really the action of it is only in the last 15 minutes, where I really would have thought people would discover the giant further in, but it was I had it written down. It was I thought that it was really past the 50-minute mark when anything more conventional happens, and that just really shows the interesting pacing of the movie. And that's why you'd think, oh, this is probably a 2-hour movie, because after pretty much an hour in is when the plot really ramps up. But because the movie is only an hour and 20 minutes, that means that it's entirely just the climax of when you really feel the plot is starting.
I think too that another thing, something they could have done, and maybe it would have taken a different type of movie, a different focus of this movie altogether, because it's very much on Hogarth trying to the whole movie is just about this idea that Hogarth has trouble, finding people to relate to. That's why he keeps bringing in all these stray animals he finds. That's kind of why he relates to Dean in the first place, because Dean's also this outsider type. And I wish we would have seen maybe a little bit more of that, because it's not really reflected so much in the town. I think you could have done more with that, with the whole idea of the Red Scare aspect of it, and with have the town's reaction to that kind of stuff, because we don't really get a lot of that. And then we see in the, when the giant saves the two boys, right? People are kind of, people are thankful towards him, and the townspeople kind of realize, oh, he's this, he is a helpful guy. But there's none of that lead up to it, right? There's not real, nobody even knows he exists until really that point. So I think that's maybe not a failing, because that's probably not what the movie was really trying to do, but I think that's something else that they could have done to kind of inject a little bit more drama in it, was maybe have the giant be revealed a little bit earlier.
I think so, but then it's also, I guess, so would you have wanted the movie to be substantially longer then?
Not really, but I think they could have edited down some of the other stuff, and
Yeah,
maybe
like the
not
slice of life.
Right, maybe not substantially longer, but I think you could get this up to maybe an hour and 45 minutes and do a little bit more stuff with that without. So I think it wouldn't have been too much long. It would have improved the pacing a little bit more, I think, if you had done something like that, especially because there's this whole fascination the giant has with Superman, right?
Yeah. And that plays into where like the Superman thing is fun, but I feel like they didn't talk about it much to really be such a part of the character arc. Like maybe it would have been fun to have seen him try to save someone and fail. And then, this is really when he gets his redemption, because it's not really like he needed to redeem himself.
Right.
Because everyone, by the point that he has to sacrifice himself, everyone knows what he is. He doesn't have to prove anything. He's not, say, a martyr.
Right, exactly.
And it is a little frustrating how like everything Kent is saying is pretty easily disproven. And so it would have been nice for them to have been some morally gray stuff, not necessarily because the giant was acting evil, but just because he's such a large figure. And sometimes when you try and do the right thing, it doesn't always work out. And that's really a lesson that wasn't built into the fabric of the series, because the giant is always, besides, being childlike or animalistic like a dog, he doesn't do anything amoral.
Right. The closest we ever get is when Hogarth points the toy gun at him and his defense system kicks in. That's it. And we never see anything. I was expecting to see a little bit more of that after that scene happened, but it's kind of like just gone very quickly, and we don't deal so much. And I think there's a lot you could do there with, I think if I were writing this movie, I think I would have put that scene a lot earlier. And I would have had the giant try to maybe suppress his programming or something to avoid that happening again. And so then when the danger really does come, then it's a situation when it's like, okay, well, I promise not to use violence anymore, but now, my family, for lack of a better word, is in danger. What am I supposed to do now? I think that would have made it a lot, because there is no moral quandary that the giant faces, really.
Yeah.
Or even Hogarth. Like, Hogarth doesn't really face any sort of moral quandary either. Like, they're just basically in the right the whole time.
Yeah, that's the problem, is I think the good characters are too good and the evil character, like literally the evil character is fine killing children. And I think that just kind of takes away, where you just can't have someone that blatantly evil. I know he's supposed to represent like abnormality and what have you in the Red Scare, but there's just like a point where there wasn't enough ethical playing around in this movie to make it not feel like it was above being a well-done children's movie.
If anything, I think if you'd combined aspects of Kent and Rogard together to create a more complex character, I think that would have been a little bit more interesting, as opposed to just having this one character who's very level-headed and he's working for the government, but he's very level-headed. He knows when he's made the wrong move, and the other character just being, a complete total fucking asshole. Then that makes it harder to really kind of relate to that. And yeah, you're right. It's just the only time the good characters ever do anything wrong, it's very small, and they quickly realize their mistake. Like when Dean sends the Iron Giant away, or when I can't even think of when Hogarth accidentally, he accidentally causes the train accident, right? And even that's very minor in comparison. So yeah, there's not a lot of that stuff going on. I think for all the time the movie spends dealing with these like slice of life stuff, a lot of that stuff could have been trimmed in order to make room for some more character development.
Yeah. Now, do you think the train would have been more interesting if it was a more severe accident?
It might have. I mean, I'm not sure if you could do that in a kids movie, right? Have like the hero kill some train passengers, even accidentally, but it definitely would have changed the stakes a little bit, and it definitely would have added some more conflict for the characters to deal with. I think so. But also, talking about the Superman thing, and like you mentioned, that the Superman aspect's not really that touched upon. Because you also think about the time period this takes place in, 1957. This is still the golden age, and Superman's much more of a social justice type character in this time period as well. So I think when you're setting it in the Cold War and you've got that whole Superman thing going on, there's so much more you can do with that I feel the movie doesn't even barely scratch the surface of what you can do with that.
Yeah. And then would you have wanted there to have been a sequel, or do you think that's unnecessary?
I'm not sure, because I don't think maybe not a sequel, but I think I just wanted a rewrite of this script more than anything is what I would have wanted to do.
Yeah.
I don't know. What about you? Because I'm not sure if there was, it seems to set itself up for a sequel, but I'm not sure if there's any actual talk about a sequel.
I think they said they would have been fine. They would have had no issues making a sequel, but they didn't think a sequel was necessary.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think a sequel would have really helped at all. I think it would have. I can't imagine anything they would have done in the sequel that would have. There's obviously a lot more you can do with this character, but I don't think it's anything that these filmmakers would have wanted to do with the character.
I assume they would have played into the origins more, probably.
Right. That's probably that's probably the only thing I could think of as well. And and this is still too like the because looking at the themes of this, Brad Bird was coping with the death of his sister when he was making this, and
I wasn't aware of that context.
And it was even based on a children's book written by what was his name? Ted Hughes, who, after Sylvia Plath committed suicide, who was his wife, he had wrote this book to kind of comfort his children. And so Bird's pitch to Warner Brothers was, what if a gun had a soul and didn't want to be a gun?
Yeah.
And I feel like it doesn't quite live up to that promise, because I don't think we see enough of that conflict in The Giant.
Yeah, I feel this movie needed another 20 minutes and probably maybe some tighter pacing. So maybe a net of like an extra 25 to 30 minutes to really get a stronger message out, maybe have another set piece or two to really show, because you really only see the Giant actually doing his thing once in the entire movie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we just get that brief little hint of it early on, and then in the background, we see the laser blast, but that's it. And I think that too, understand what the Giant is capable of would have also been really good. So that's why I would have moved, again, you move that scene with Hogarth earlier in the film, you maybe see him like create a giant weapon or something and point it at Hogarth, and and then Dean steps in, and then the Giant realizes what he's done. All of that I think would have made for a lot stronger, because it also would have shown Hogarth that this guy, it's this basically wild animal, for lack of a better term. He does love you, he does care for you, but at the end of the day, he's still what he is. So there's that question too.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I think too, like having a little bit more with maybe Annie discovering the Giant earlier and having more of a reaction to it, I think would have also helped out a little bit more with that. So you would have had a little bit of a push and pull between Annie and Dean, right? Because Annie seems pretty overprotective of Hogarth. Like, don't go to bed, be in bed by 8.
Well, yeah, she is a single. I mean, that's what happens when you're a single mother.
Well, yeah, it's absolutely understandable. So I would have liked to see that come into more in regards to the Giant. Because especially that also plays into the idea of kind of the parent that kids want and the parent that kids need. Because I think that's another dichotomy you could set up with Dean and Annie, where Dean's this really cool, laid back guy. He's the kind of guy that a kid would want to have as a parent. Whereas Annie is, she's much more strict. She's much more concerned. And even though kids may not like that, that is more of the parent that you need. So I think having a little bit more drama there in regards to that would have been interesting too.
Yeah. Do you like that they got together?
I didn't really think too much of it, because it just kind of seemed like it was expected.
Yeah. I just felt like it was kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. It definitely felt arbitrary. So I didn't think too much of it, because I had expected it right from the start. It seemed like it was so obviously going to happen. So And I know they kind of, another thing they could have done, right? You kind of set up Kent here as a potential third point on that love triangle, but it never quite develops, right? This movie, I think that's what's frustrating about this movie is, and I didn't really realize this until I wasn't expecting to have this kind of conversation when we started this, but but that's good. It's good. And like it would have, now that I'm thinking about it, I would have liked to see more of that, because now knowing that Hogarth's father was a soldier, like having Kent there as kind of like a replacement for him, and whereas Dean is like the complete opposite of her husband, it would have been so much more interesting to set up that kind of conflict and that kind of dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's something that they had to cut for time, was really exploring his father.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that feels like it was cut out or not even put in the movie in the first place. And I think, yeah, I mean, as much as good, and I'm not saying, for anyone who's, listening to this and shaking their fist at me right now, like, I don't think it's a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination. I just think there are so many different things they could have done better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that makes sense.
So, how has this colored your perception of it now that you're rewatching this movie and reapproaching this classic from your childhood?
I mean, I think, to be honest, I think my opinion stays the same. Like, I enjoyed it, but it wasn't, I mean, there's a reason I haven't rewatched this movie in probably a decade. Is I remember it being a good movie, but not a movie I always need to constantly rewatch. Like, if I have kids, I'm sure I'll show it to them at some point, but it's not the top of the list,
Yeah, I think I got the same feeling too. Like, I was watching this, my daughter's only about 1 now, so she's not quite old enough to understand it, but and she was, she watched like the first 5 minutes with me and then she fell asleep. But she's not at that age yet where she can really sit and pay attention to a movie. But I think when she gets older, I would definitely show this to her. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I am impressed that it did do some things that I wouldn't expect a kids movie to do. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is me expecting too much of a kids movie in the end, because I think it kind of impressed me too much by being so direct with the Cold War themes that I wanted it to do more. Yeah.
And it's interesting how the Cold War themes didn't exist when this movie came out, or when the book it's based on came out.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I'd never even considered that. And so yeah, when did the book come out exactly?
1968.
1968. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So it came out after that time. So yeah, it is interesting that Bird decided to set it in this time period. What do you think was the reason behind that? Do you think it was really just the Cold War themes, or do you think there was just some other reason why?
I mean, I feel like that was really the best setting for this, because also obviously couldn't do it nowadays because it was just too connected to hide something like that. And I think it was just having a theme like this in the 80s would have been overdone, because people have been like, oh, it's like E.T. but with a giant robot instead.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the 60s really added an interesting sense and a peacefulness to everything. Like the duck and cover element really is a 60s capstone. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And it turns out that a lot of people did actually compare it to E.T. when it came out too. Well, there you go.
Also, this one, Roger Ebert actually compared it to Hayao Miyazaki. So, which I'm not sure. I can see kind of that, but I feel like Miyazaki he's much more direct. He's less shy about addressing the themes he wants to address. And that could just be like, working in the Hollywood studio system and, Brad Bird not wanting to ruffle too many feathers with an animated movie about the Cold War. But like I just watched, I teach a class in Japanese film, and like just the other day we did The Wind Rises, and that is, such a blunt criticism of Japan during the war, and it's a Japanese movie, so, and a Japanese kids animation no less. And so yeah, I thought, or like something like Grave of the Fireflies too, which is also a very blunt denunciation of war overall, but this one it plays it very safe in comparison to Miyazaki.
Yeah, it's also just he didn't have a lot of budget too, because this was considered a fairly low budget movie, so I'm sure that has heavily restricted his ability to have really done what he wanted.
Right. That's yeah. Like I said, $30 million budget. And I'm sure that, or no, $50 million budget. And I'm sure most of that went into the CGI effects.
Yeah.
Speaking of the CGI and the Iron Giant's design, it was actually designed by Joe Johnston, who he directed The Rocketeer, he directed Captain America: The First Avenger.
Oh wow.
And he's he also directed Jurassic Park 3, but we don't talk about that. But I think it was a good choice because he's got a very strong pulp sensibility, and you really see that reflected in the design of the giant. And you know, when I think about stuff like The Rocketeer, when I think about The First Avenger, when I think about the design he did for this, you know, I feel like I want to see him especially make more movies in this time period.
Yeah, I think this is definitely an era, but the problem is I think why the 80s are so big is now everyone who was a kid in the 80s now gets to make these movies, and I think we've really lost our opportunity for the 60s, which is slowly starting to become less of a living, you know, we're starting to lose the people that were alive in this era.
Yeah, there's maybe a little bit too much focus on the 80s as of late.
Oh yeah. It's a great decade.
But something else too, watching this movie and also thinking about what he did with The Incredibles and also just like the sheer pace of action in Ghost Protocol, like makes me wonder, like, how come nobody has thought to give Brad Bird a Superman movie now?
So people have been saying Brad Bird would be perfect to direct the Fantastic Four. So I'm really hoping that happens.
That would be, he would definitely be good for that too. And you know, John Watts has now stepped down from that, so who knows? It's a possibility.
That's why I'm hoping.
I mean, I would love to see him direct a Fantastic Four movie. I would love to see him direct a Superman movie too. I mean, think either one of those. I mean, I think this movie definitely, The Incredibles definitely shows he's got a lot in him to do a Fantastic Four movie. This, I think, definitely shows he's got a lot in him to do a Superman movie, and Ghost Protocol proves that he knows how to handle the action.
Oh yeah, Ghost Protocol is great.
Yeah, I mean that tower scene. Every time I watch it, it's just like heart stopping. I
can't wait though for the next one.
Yeah.
Did you see Top Gun Maverick?
Not yet. No.
That's great.
I know. I want to see it, but you know, we got one kid running around. We got another one coming soon. So it really kind of restricts the time I can go out to the theater. Yeah. So we'll probably have to wait till that one comes out on video. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. I mean, people have been saying it's even better than the first one.
It's way better, and see it in IMAX if you can.
I will. Yeah. I'm hoping I can find a way to, but we'll see how that works out. Okay, Dave, anything else we really kind of wanted to talk about with Iron Giant? Because it's not a long movie, and I think we kind of touched on a lot of the big things that kind of stood out to me, and even moved into some stuff that I wasn't expecting.
No, I think I had a bunch of notes, and I really think we covered everything that I want to discuss.
Yeah. I think the sum up I would say about this, and you mentioned it's on HBO Max, so people can easily watch it now. Although you might want to play around with your audio settings.
Yeah, I'm not sure what was going on with that.
Yeah, it's a good movie. It's if you've got kids, I think it's definitely worth watching with them. I feel like if I had watched this movie when I was a kid, then I think this movie would have had a much bigger impact on me. And it's one of those things where I've talked about this before on this show, but when you're a kid and you watch something at the right age, it kind of stays with you for life.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the case is with this movie for a lot of people who were kids when it came out.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay. What about you? Do you have any other final notes about this movie?
No, I think this movie it holds up really well. It is a little slower paced, but I definitely don't regret getting to watch it again.
Yeah, it's a fun watch. I'm glad I finally got a chance to watch it. It unfortunately didn't quite live up to the potential that had been said after years of hearing how amazing it is. But overall, I liked it. I thought, like I said, I really liked the Dean character in it. I thought Vin Diesel did a lot of really good voice work, because it seems like originally they were going to electronically modulate the voice, but they didn't in this. So that's all his voice acting. And I don't know. I really feel like Vin Diesel is much better as a voice actor than an action star.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. Dave, why don't you tell people one more time where they can go and find you then?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you again, Perry, for having me on the show. This is a ton of fun, and it was great having a chance to rewatch it. But you can find me, my co-host, and a guest every single Monday on the Shonen Flop Podcast. That's SHONENFLOP, where we look at some weird and wild manga, seeing what they did wrong, what they did right, what they could have done to have prevented being a flop. It's a ton of fun. Appreciate if you check us out. We're on, as I said at the start, we're on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, wherever else you get your podcast.
Okay, very cool. All right, yeah, and thanks so much and we'll have all that information in the show notes again. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. You're more than welcome to come back on anytime you want.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. A little bit shorter than our usual episodes, but every now and then, that's okay. It happens every now and then. And so you guys can get on with your day. You don't have to listen to me ramble too long. Then
it's probably the fact that the movie is about 40 minutes shorter than the average film you probably cover for this.
I think that's a big part of it too. But anyway, superherocinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And remember, if you sign up for our Patreon subscription, even at any level, $1 a month, whatever it is, then you get these episodes a week early, and you also get access to the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club companion podcast, where I, sometimes alone, sometimes with the guests, do cover different comic books and graphic novels and stuff like that. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.